Hello and welcome to the first in what will become a series of videos introducing the field of career counseling. These are prepared primarily for my wonderful graduate students at Albertus Magnus College, but they will be sent to public, so guests are invited. And today we're really doing the beginning, kind of a brief overview of everything. And let's really just get started with that then, shall we? Here we go. A little bit of a slideshow to go with it. So again, basic concepts, a little bit of history, not too much there. And okay, hold it. Yeah, there is an immediate problem one encounters teaching career counseling that one does not encounter when teaching, let's say, psychopathology or counseling techniques or clinical assessment, and that is that there's understandably, I think, a certain amount of resistance to the field. And I'm quite sympathetic to this. When I did a counseling master's degree about 35 years ago, I remember really being puzzled, like, why is this dumb class in the curriculum? And the instructor, by the way, was perfectly competent, pretty good, but he didn't really close the deal with me. And, like, why is that? Well, a lot of us going into, especially if it's a mental health counseling program or something similar, we're really turned on by psychotherapy. That's what brings us to the field. And we understand that not all counseling is, full-on psychotherapy, but career counseling just seems an awful long way away. We get these images of, walking into an office. Do you get a job? Like, oh, you could go there, and as if that's all there is. And yeah, I get that. I really do. So let me do what my old instructor didn't do and try to sell you on this. And I'm going to build a case for why you should actually care about career counseling. And we'll start off with the most basic, simple stuff, right? If you're somebody in any kind of a licensed track program, and not all of you will be, but some are, well, you need a course in career counseling in order to become a licensed counselor. It's a required part of the curriculum, required by accreditation standards, legislation, et cetera. So, deal. Furthermore, a little more personal for you, you're probably at that point going to be taking the so-called NCE, the more common of the licensing exams, and career counseling is pretty big on the test. So you really have to know something about it to make it through. So the second thing I want to say perhaps comes a little closer to issues of personal identity, right? Professions are in large part defined by whatever it is that is unique about practitioners in that field. So physicians, lawyers, accountants, architects, each have a kind of core area of expertise that isn't really shared by anyone else. Now, in the mental health field, when you're thinking of counseling and psychotherapy, there actually are a number of distinct professions that provide these services. So, in addition to counselors, you have psychiatrists, you have clinical psychologists, you have social workers, you have family therapists. So at least 5 professions. One could perhaps add psychiatric nurses to that list, make it 6, all providing counseling and psychotherapy. So that's not a unique feature. However, in the case of of counseling, the counseling profession, the career work actually is the origin story. It is where the counseling profession came from. And it's really the one thing that counselors know something about that honestly none of those other professions typically know anything at all about. Now, yeah, okay. So what? It still sounds a bit lame. Like, do I really need to be identified with, the origin story of my field when that's not really what I want to do? So I'm going to try to make this a little more real for you. Okay, why really care about this? I have 2 approaches I can take to really hopefully closing the deal with you. And here's one. Okay, I'll admit it. Very few of you are going to become full-time career counselors. And in the course of your ordinary clinical practices, you will probably only occasionally, if ever, be called on to provide explicitly career counseling. But, career-related concerns are important. We're making big decisions about our lives. We're very concerned with how our working lives unfold. And, okay, go all the way back to Freud if you like psychotherapy. And you may recall that he said that the criteria by which we can judge somebody's psychological health are their capacity for love and for work. If you can love, if you can work, if you can, in psychoanalytic terms, appropriately and joyfully express sexuality and aggression, that's what love and work are all about, you're a good, well put together person. You're okay. You don't have to be free of symptoms. You don't have to be free of conflict. In fact, you can't be. There will always be some unhappiness in your life, but if you can do these things, you're fine. Now, I think that most people practicing one form or another of psychotherapy are pretty tuned in to things around love and relationships and attachment and sexuality and all that sort of thing, but probably not as well attuned to the issues people have around their ambitions and the frustrations they face in their goal-directed strivings and their attempts at achieving a certain status and whether they're effective and respected in their work. But think about your life. Those are probably just about as important as your love life and your friendships. Here's the other angle of approach I can take towards much the same end, really. Psychotherapists, this is probably especially true of folks broadly speaking practicing in the CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy world, are often very into the idea of reducing the severity of symptoms, right? So your patients don't suffer as much. My depression gets better. My OCD takes up fewer hours out of my day. I'm not damaging myself as much with the drink, whatever it happens to be. Now, first, I want you to think of the subset of your clients, which for most of you will probably be most of them, though not necessarily, who are generally functional people. They are able to hold a job. They have at least one friend out there. So there is some capacity for love and work, right? Though they have problems, and those problems may include depression, panic attacks, OCD, drinking, whatever. Okay. Average it out over the whole course of a whole year. And if you have had some problems yourself, think of it this way. Like, okay, you had a depressive episode somewhere. Over the course of the entire year, if you average it out, how many hours a week did you spend doing your symptoms? That is, not just being in an episode, but actively being like, wow, I'm miserable right now. I can't do anything right now. I don't know what number you're going to come up with, but just, think of what's a reasonable number of hours to actually spend devoted to your symptoms. And then you have to ask, how many hours a week do you spend at work on average? And work, I want to say, and I'll probably say this again, work includes school, work includes paid employment, work includes things you need to do around the house and for your family. It's all work. But even if you just think about paid work, you're probably, average full-time worker is putting in a good 40 hours a week. Okay, there's a few weeks vacation. Maybe it brings it down a little, but not a lot. That's average across 7 days a week. That's 6 hours. So 6 hours a day on average working. For some, it's much more than that, of course. And, then you have to add in another 7 or 8 hours for sleep. And you're saying, out of my waking hours, I'm spending more than a third, maybe as much as half of them working. That's more than you're spending thinking about your panic attacks. Now, on the other hand, think about your more severely impaired patients, people with severe and persistent forms of mental illness who are perhaps disabled, unable to work, in the competitive workplace at any rate. Think of them. Now, yeah, they have symptoms that bother them a lot, but even they will tell you, if asked, that what they really want are ways of structuring their days. They want things to do to give their days structure and meaning, purpose of some kind or other. So it's not just an empty day, smoking cigarettes and staring at the wall or at a TV set. That's what they want. And all of this would fall under the purview of career counseling and the closely related field of vocational rehabilitation. And, besides, if I cut your depression in half, so however we're mapping out how severe your depression is, right? If I cut that in half, I have successfully made you less unhappy, and that's a good thing. If I can help you to cut your OCDing time from 2 hours a day to 1 hour a day, that's a good thing. You are now a less miserable human being. But now think about work. Of course, if you're going to a job you hate, you're going to be unhappy all the day. If we could take that away, you'll be less unhappy. But suppose that we're able to find things that you can do with your days that you find interesting, rewarding, maybe even fun and exciting. Maybe we can actually make you not less unhappy, but more positively happy. And in that sense, career counseling ties right in with the field of positive psychology that's gotten so much press over the last, basically the 21st century, thanks to Martin Seligman and some other people, right? It's not all about pathology. It's about functionality, and it's about enhancement of our lives, not, again, simply making things a little less bad. So again, be aware when you're speaking with a client, even if you're practicing capital P psychotherapy, right? Be aware, have the ears to listen when they talk about their concerns about their work, their concerns about their successes, their failures, the factors that seem to be working against them in the competitive world of school and work and so forth. It's very important to be aware of that stuff. And again, many therapists really aren't. Okay. And so if I have succeeded in selling you on this, and that may or may not be the case, I do want to encourage you not to feel badly about, your interest in the field. It's, it is a legitimately potentially interesting subject. If I haven't sold you on it, that's okay too. Just bear with me, stay the course, learn what you need to learn, pass the exam, and try to forget anything I ever said or anything you ever read on the subject. But honestly, I do believe there's more of interest and more of value in this field than most of us, including myself as a grad student, are aware. Okay, now let me hit us with a few basic terms, and then there'll be kind of a change in direction where if people want to take a break, like leave the video and come back after a cup of coffee or dinner or sleeping or something, feel free. But I want to go over a few basic terms that will help us to kind of zero in on what career counseling does entail. And these are terms that, as people use them in everyday jargon, lingo, might almost sound synonymous, but they aren't. That's important. If I had you here in front of me, I'd have you define them and we'd sort of circle around and figure out that way. As it is, I just got to go and tell you. That's the world of Zoom. So we'll start with a job. A job's pretty easy to define, more or less, right? It's something you do in exchange for some sort of payment, usually money. Sometimes room and board might be included, or other benefits, health insurance, etc. But the main idea is, I do this for you, you pay me in something of value, mostly money. There it is. That's a job. Now, for career counseling, jobs as such are not the main event. There is overlap, and we'll keep again circling around to these things. There is overlap with the sorts of people who provide employment counseling, who actually help you to connect with a job. Yes, again, we'll come back to that, but it's not the core of the field. We get closer when we look at the term occupation. So what's your occupation? Well, your occupation is what you do, or in some cases, it might not even be exactly what you're doing now, but it's what you envision yourself as doing. It's your occupational identity. Now, again, usually your job is connected to your occupation. So, you have a law degree and you've passed the bar exam and you work for a law firm or for a public defender's office. You have your graduate degree in, say, counseling, and you've passed the counseling exam, and you're working for a counseling agency or running a private practice, et cetera. But of course, you could change jobs 3, 4, 5, 6 times. and still be in the same occupation. Also, you could find that your job isn't in what you think of as your occupation. Yes, you have a law degree, but you happen to be working in an administrative capacity for, say, a bank. Yes, you have a counseling degree, but you happen to be working in an administrative capacity again for a school. Or it could be further afield. Your occupational identity is that of a musician. You're a really good guitar player and pretty good vocalist, at least for background vocals. But most of your income doesn't come from your performances or your recordings. Most of your income comes from some other job you have that helps you to pay the bills. So you work, as an insurance agent, or you work as a server in a restaurant, but you don't identify perhaps with the occupation of insurance agent or the occupation of server or waiter. You identify as musician, you see. That's an important difference. Then there's vocation. This one's closely related to occupation, but it's a bit more specialized, a bit more narrow. By history, vocation literally means calling, translates as calling. By history, this comes out of the world of religion, that certain people would be said, say in the Catholic Church, to have a vocation for the priesthood, right? Or if you're a woman, the Catholic Church doesn't yet allow that, so a vocation for a religious profession, for joining one of the orders of sisters, such as the Dominican Sisters of the Peace. The calling is something that, in a sense, you must answer in order to fulfill your own destiny. You must become this. It's a core part of your identity, not simply something you choose to be part of your identity, like most occupations would be, but something that you must do, or else you will remain forever unfulfilled. Now, originally, again, it came from the idea of a vocation for the priesthood. Are you called to the service of God? But the word is now used much more generally. Some people, not by any means everybody, not even perhaps most people, but some people really do feel called to a certain kind of work. I think some of you will resonate with this. It's quite common among people who enter helping professions, whether it's as therapists, of one sort or another, as educators or what have you, that there's a sense this is what I really should be doing with my life. Many artists, musicians, writers also have this sort of feeling, and so do people in other lines of work, by the way. So if one has a vocation, that's important to realize, to recognize, and to find one's way into, basically. And then there's this closely related term, again, avocation, which is like a vocation, only it's not, right? The key difference here is that an avocation is something that you feel strongly called to and you must engage in, but you are not using as your source of income, as your way of making a living. So it's you could make a little income, I guess that's what they call a side hustle, right? But in most cases, it's not. You could think of it as pretty closely, almost synonymous really with a hobby, but a hobby that you have a really strong investment in, and not always a recreational activity, which is what a hobby usually implies. For example, you do feel some calling, let's say, to the service of God and of the faith community in whatever faith tradition you belong to. You're not becoming a minister or rabbi, a Brahmin, what have you, but so you have your regular job and you have your regular family and all that, but you do serve perhaps as a deacon or serve on the board of trustees of your congregation. You do sing in the choir. You need to carve out time in your life for board meetings, for your diaconal duties, for choir practice and performances. And this is an essential part of your life. Well, look, this is part of career counseling too. It's about career and your whole lifestyle. So if somebody does feel really called to engage in something else, I used religion as an example. It could just as easily be an athletic enterprise. It could be one of the arts or many other things. Then their life has to be constructed in such a way that there's room for that. And that puts certain constraints on what they're going to do in terms of their main occupation and job, right? My calling is outside of my job. I need to have a job that lets me pursue my calling. We're trying to help people find that kind of balance. Lastly, there's career. Where career changes, everything we've looked at so far, it's different from an occupation in particular, is that we're adding the element of time. We're adding the element of development over time. An occupation is some part of my identity fixed at this point in time. That may remain the case forever. It may change. My job may remain the same for a very long time, or it may change quite frequently. My career is all of that. It's all of my experiences in school, learning and developing, both as a child, as an adult. It's all the jobs I've ever held, the occupational hats I've worn, the progress I've made, the blocks I've faced, the changes I've chosen or been forced into. All of that is your career, however smooth or however rocky the course may be. That's the idea here. So those are really the key terms. Now, at this point, we are going to go back in time and consider the origins of the field. This is, if you need a break, this is a good time to either pause this and go do something else or turn it off and remember where you were and come back later on. But if you're still with me, here we go. Let me contextualize this first. Career counseling originated in the United States of America back in the 90s. Now, the 90s were a time when a lot was going on. The economy was changing very rapidly. There were new technologies being introduced, which changed how work was done, and whole new occupations were being introduced that would service these or draw upon these new technologies. Some of the old occupations were being transformed almost unrecognizably. Some were shrinking drastically, disappearing, while new things were emerging, again, that people didn't even know what they were yet. The population of America was also changing rapidly. You had large numbers of immigrants coming in, very large numbers, and many of them coming not from the sort of traditional feeders of American immigration, but from, different cultural backgrounds, different languages and faith traditions and so forth. A time that could be very confusing, in other words, because, many people then either are being displaced out of older occupations, or they're new to the country altogether, or their parents are. They don't really quite know what they're supposed to be doing. Employers who are, scrambling to fill positions in these new fields of work don't really know where to look for people. Well, this is where career counseling comes from. Oh, in case you hadn't twigged to this yet, we're talking about the 1890s. So yeah, the 1990s did look kind of like that too, didn't they? But the 1890s, okay, what are the technologies? Well, it's things like automobiles, telephones, and electricity, right? Big changes, factories with assembly lines were a new thing, maybe a little later. The new places people were coming from were places like Southern Italy, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. Et cetera. So it was a different subset of things than in the 1990s, but the same general idea. Okay, so here's the question then: what are we going to do for, and what are we going to do about all the young men and women who are roving the streets of our cities, the immigrants and their children, the migrants from the countryside and their children, who don't quite know what to do with themselves? Now, what we want to do for them is to help them to lead more successful lives. We want them to find their way and be able to make it, basically. There's also another motive going on here, though, which is to help to maintain, to preserve the social order. Because when you have an awful lot of young people who don't know what to do with themselves, you can get trouble. You can have people engaging in crime and alcohol and drug abuse and prostitution and all that sort of thing. Also, you can have people then who, if they don't have proper, even soft skills, let alone hard skills for the workplace, are not going to be working, and employers are going to be searching unsuccessfully for people to work in their factories and mills and so forth. So there's kind of a double impetus here. There's help the people, young people. There's also help keep the oiling the economy, the gears of the economy, and keep things humming and keep society in an orderly way. There's a little tension there, to be sure. But in this context, you started to have organizations forming, like the best known, perhaps, the YMCA. And in our lives, if you're like me, you think of the YMCA mainly as where you maybe learned to swim and went to an inexpensive summer camp, for a couple of weeks or a month, in July or August. But the YMCA does do more than that, and used to do more a lot. It was a place where you could rent a room that would be inexpensive, clean, simple, safe, in a crime-free zone, right? In a drink and drug-free zone, at least back in the day. You could, of course, exercise in the gym instead of going to the bar. That's good for society, and strong young people going to work. And they started to include, along the way, they'd have little talks about religion, and talks about lessons about literacy and numeracy, things you might have missed in school. But they started in the 1890s to add employment offices. So if I ran a pickle factory, I could, get on the electric telephone, crank the thing up and say, hey, Betsy, over at the YMCA employment office, I need 3 people who can help me to brine cucumbers, and here's what they need to be able to do. And Betsy would write it all down. And when one of you would come in, like, Betsy, I need a job, I need a job real bad. And she'd be like, well, the Joy Pickle Cup Factory, needs people. Here, let me write down the contact information. Go see Mr. Joy and tell him I sent you, and there you'd go, which is not career counseling, but it's a necessary precursor to career counseling, right? So the transition to real career counseling happens thanks to this dude, Frank Parsons, our founder. So this guy is to career counseling what Sigmund Freud is to psychotherapy, right? He really is the one who got the whole thing going. Little bit of background on him, I'll be quick. Okay, he was apparently a very bright kid. He went off to Cornell to study civil engineering and finished his degree by age 18. The ages were a bit looser then about starting and finishing college. That's still on the young side. So he's out there, he goes to work for the railroads, designing, building railroad bridges, that kind of thing. And a year later, there's an economic downturn and the railroads are letting everybody go. So he has to change hats, right? He becomes a school teacher, goes to a secondary school and starts teaching, presumably a lot of, math and English and all that. Meanwhile, in the evenings, he's moonlighting, studying the law. In those days, many lawyers didn't go to law school. Instead, you were allowed to read up on the law. And if you studied, and then you could be admitted to take the bar exam. And if you passed it, now you're a lawyer, lower prestige than if you'd gone to a law school, but you still could practice. And he did, within 8 years, he had studied enough in his spare time to pass the Massachusetts bar exam. And he then starts doing a moonlighting for money, writing law textbooks, very, very energetic young man here. And eventually, about 10 years later or so, is hired by Boston University as a lecturer in law. So now instead of teaching, little 15-year-olds, he's teaching, adults the law. Now, more interestingly, from our point of view, he was involved in what was then, as in again today, known as the progressive movement. So the activists in this movement were trying to make the country more fair to the little guy, trying to have government work for the little guy, for the people, et cetera, not be primarily or exclusively in the service of the owners of the factories and so forth. And so he was a writer, a pamphleteer, and book writer for rhetorical propaganda for the progressive cause, a speaker and an organizer, and very active. And one of the activities he engaged in was to create what he called a vocation bureau or the Vocation Bureau at one of these, charitable organizations in Boston, the Civic Service House. He had this fairly terrible motto: light, information, inspiration, cooperation. I mean, they're all good words. I don't know how he put them together, but there it was. And it started out as, your basic, like, yes, here's a job ticket, go see if they'll hire you. But he very quickly wanted to move beyond that. He again, you could tell this was somebody who had, a great intellectual ability, and he had some good ideas too. So what does he do? Well, he starts training his people to become what we now would call counselors, and has a whole training manual for this. Unfortunately, he died at a relatively early age, but his people, the ones who've been working for him, wanted the work to continue, so they published his book, right? The big book on the subject. And here he has a much better credo than his motto for the Bureau. Quote, "It is better to choose an occupation than merely to hunt for a job." So don't just pound the pavement seeing who's hiring, take down the ticket, whatever it is. If it looks like you could maybe do it, take that job and stay there until they maybe let you go. Instead, try to figure out what you would be both happy and successful at. That's the idea. So how do we do that? Well, what Parsons says is a person really needs to have three capabilities, skill sets, areas of knowledge, whatever you want to call them. I'm going to use direct quotes here because his quotes are pretty good, but I'll also simplify the language later on. So number one, a clear understanding of yourself, your attitudes, abilities, interests, ambitions, resource limitations, and their causes. What are you good at? What do you like to do? Where do you want to go in life? What obstacles are in your way, right? And why? Self-knowledge. Secondly, a knowledge of the requirements and conditions of success, advantages and disadvantages, compensations, opportunities, and prospects in different lines of work. In other words, know what's out there. What do people do? What can people do? How do you get to do that? What happens if you do that? Is it hard to break into that? Is it easy to get ahead once you're there? You need to know that stuff. And third, quote again, true reasoning on the correct relations of these two groups of facts, right? So here's what I'm into, here's what I'm good at, here are some of the things that limit me, here's all the stuff that's out there. Where might I fit? Where might I fit? True reasoning. That's it. Now, this is the beginning of career counseling. Specifically, it's the beginning of a family of approaches, most often referred to as the trait and factor approaches. Traits of the individual, factors in the environment that interact with those traits, basically. This isn't the only way of doing career counseling anymore, but it's still a very influential way. And as you'll see, there are two or three of the most prominent models used in career counseling that are basically directly descended from this. So what do the counselors do? Aha, well, you're going to have to help them with those three things, basically. So you want to help your clients arrive at a deeper and richer self-understanding. As in, I think, most any form of counseling or psychotherapy, it's important to reflect on your own experience. It's important to have some awareness, some insight into who you are. Unlike most forms of counseling, not entirely unlike, but I will say to a much greater extent than is true in most forms of counseling and psychotherapy, career counselors do utilize formal tests and measures and feedback, direct feedback on the results of those tests. And we will, in the course of our time together, not today, but in future sessions, be examining some of these tests and the different types of measures that are out there. It's not all testamentellum, as some have pejoratively put it in the past, but career counselors in general are pretty comfortable with the idea of using tests as a way of facilitating some aspects of the counseling process. Other, more like psychotherapists, that's much more variable, and I would say that it's only a subset who would do that. Secondly, world of work knowledge is what I like to call it. Again, what's out there? What do people do? How do they get to do it? What's it like to do it? And sometimes career counselors are very directly informing clients that, yes, well, this is what they do, or putting directly in, touch with the information. The old days often involved handing them a brochure you'd pull out of a file cabinet. Today, it's more likely to be, send them a web page, from some resource on the internet. Equally important, if not more important, though, we want to teach our clients how to find information for themselves, because the process of their career development is not likely to be concluded after the few sessions that we spend together. There may well be considerable work left for them to do, and we want them to be better able to do it than they were before. Thirdly, decision-making skills. So a client may have an immediate decision they need to make, whether or not to go to graduate school, or in what field, whether to accept a particular job offer or to choose between different occupations that they're going to, frame their resume for. Yes, we help them with the immediate decision. We also hope to, again, it's not exactly teaching, but it kind of, there's an psychoeducational quality to this. We hope them to help them to develop their capacity for identifying problems, framing problems, and working their way through to effective decisions relative to where they were before they met with us. So those are, the three things that Parsons said they need. We're going to help them have. That's the gist of it. So again, I'm emphasizing there's some relationship here, but career counseling is not the same thing as employment counseling. Employment counselors did kind of peel off from career counselors, I don't know, 70, 80 years ago or something, maybe not quite that, but something in that ballpark. It is different to, say, walk into a place and say, hey, I need a job. And they say, oh, well, here are your qualifications. Oh, look, we have these 3 openings, go and apply, versus meeting with a career counselor to do more, to learn about, what you might really want to do with your life. But at the same time, there is overlap. And that's especially true if you're either a guidance counselor in secondary school or working in a college career counseling office. You have people coming in who probably need some career counseling. They're also hoping that you're going to help them with the process of job search, landing a job or searching for a college or a graduate school and so forth. So, yes, you're providing career counseling. You're also keeping a list of, employers, contacts with local employers, contacts with, college admissions officers or graduate schools, organizing job fairs, running resume writing workshops. Those sorts of things are also going to be part of your life, even though you might not think of that as being at the very core of your essence as a counselor. And yes, occasionally you get someone who wants to be a mad scientist, and you have to deal with it. I'm trying with these comics, by the way. It's really hard to find career counseling comics, and they're rarely any good. But these are like the pick of the litter as far as I can tell. So best I can do. Okay, so now is the second time where if you need a break, go ahead and take one, or again, you need to leave and come back tomorrow, go ahead. Here's going to be the very brief and way oversimplified history of career counseling. And what I've done here is to basically break it into 4 units in chronological order and just say a little bit about what's happening in each of these units. It shouldn't take very long, because it's like impossible for me to make this super interesting. I believe me, I'm trying, but this is the hard part. So, okay, phase 1, from the beginnings, very early 1900s, up into the mid to late 1920s, maybe early 30s at the latest, right? First 25, 30 years here. It's mostly about vocational education. Most of what you're seeing is happening in the schools. the rest is happening at, again, agencies like, YMCA or private vocation bureau type places. And you're teaching people about what's out there, essentially. So here's a kind of a job people get. This is an occupation. Here's what they do in that. Do you think it sounds like you could do that? Honestly, I think most of the folks providing what was then called vocational guidance were at least as interested in keeping society humming and the economy humming as they were in the well-being of the students or people coming in off the street looking for help. That was a lot of what they were really interested in. Side note, by the way, think about time frame here. Universal compulsory education and the professionalism of teaching, undergrad, of primary and secondary school teaching really only got rolling in the 1880s and 90s. So it was still very new at this point. And so, the idea of what was then referred to as a guidance specialist, right, this is one of the things that was added into the mix in secondary schools from a very early time on. I mean, the public secondary schools, that is. And this is, origins. It used to be guidance, then it became guidance and counseling, then counseling and guidance, and eventually counseling over the years, right? One of the big things they used to do was what they called try out by doing. So you have the student who says, I'm kind of interested in I like machinery, and I'm very interested in like the newspaper business. Like, oh, well, why don't we have you spend a few weeks at the printing press for the local newspaper? Let me get on the electric telephone again, and I'll give a call to, so-and-so, and we'll have you go there. People act as though, the idea of doing internships and externships is this cutting edge educational thing. Yeah, it was in like 1905, right? Anyhow, the profession does begin to form. The original name was the NVGA. That's been changed a couple times, but here it was. So that's the first few decades. Now, phase two is getting us into really the 1930s, 40s, early 50s, maybe. A little overlap for these phases. There's a shift in the emphasis here. Less on, let's teach you about occupations and get you placed in a job. More about, how do we find a way for you to be satisfied with your life? In the world of education, this is happening in the context of the very influential work of Dewey, who really changed how we thought about what we do, especially in elementary school, from being all about disciplining them and forcing them to learn certain things, and then pushing them on to the next level, and more about how do we develop the personhood of the child. Yes, they need to learn things like reading, writing, arithmetic, etc. So, history. They also need to develop as humans. And of course, you had paralleling this, the very earliest work of Carl Rogers, though he doesn't fully come into his own until a little later. During this period too, remember, we're in the Great Depression for part of this, and then Second World War and its immediate aftermath. The government under Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes much more actively involved, engaged in the economy and in citizens' lives than it ever had been before. One small piece of this was the creation of the United States Employment Service. So now you have what we would call career counselors, then vocational guidance specialists, in three settings: the schools, where they've been right along, but they're changing what they do; the private agencies, where they've been right along; and also government agencies. The other major development happening here is that across the whole broad field of psychology and its close cousins, such as counseling, the technology of psychological testing, of assessment, was progressing rapidly. And this included both measures of abilities and measures of what we might call personality features. Within the domain of career counseling, you saw the first interest inventories introduced the strong interest inventory that we're going to spend some time on in this course, the Cooter Occupational Interest Survey, which we won't spend as much time on, but these are both still around in one form or another, as well as the so-called General Aptitude Test Battery, which was a measure of aptitudes. We'll spend a bit of time on that in a future session as well. So a lot's happening. Now, phase 3, we're getting close. We're now getting into, starting somewhere in the 50s and going up into the late 70s, early 80s, somewhere in there. Okay, well, one big thing that's happening is that the scale of post-secondary education grows exponentially in the aftermath of the Second World War, thanks in large part to the GI Bill, right? So you have lots more people looking for what am I going to do, and a need for career counselors in these growing colleges and universities. In the field itself, you see an increasing focus on the idea of career development across the lifespan. So there's less of a single-minded emphasis on the initial occupational choice being made by, say, an 18-year-old, and more on what happens step by step throughout the lifespan, which of course makes career counselors more useful to people who aren't, 18 or 21 years old. This is when Rogers really comes into his own also. So counseling in general is becoming much more non-directive. If you're not remembering Carl Rogers, he's the one who founded what today we call person-centered therapy, and is one of the 2 or 3 most influential people in the history of counseling and psychotherapy, hands down, no question about it. And so Rogers was moving the field away from a sort of directive, here's what you should do to solve your problem approach, and towards an approach that assumed that you already know the answers to your questions. You simply have to have faith in yourself to go in there and find them. And I have that faith in you, and I'll help you on that journey. That's in a nutshell the Rogerian approach. Now, you can integrate this with career counseling to some extent, but it's a little bit tricky because to some extent, career counseling does involve a little more, guidance than does, say, psychotherapy. So within the field of counseling, what you found is as they got more and more interested in psychotherapy, they got less and less interested in career counseling. So even though there's more and more need for it, there are fewer people going into the field, with gladness and singleness of heart, and it gets harder to actually find career counseling. For example, if you're in a high school, your guidance counselor is given an increasingly large caseload of students who they have to monitor to make sure that they're going to graduate, that they're taking the right courses and they're not getting in too much trouble. And the amount of time they have available for real counseling of any kind, especially including career counseling, is markedly circumscribed. At the same time, there's a subgroup within career counseling who kind of ignore the whole Rogerian thing and all the psychoanalytic stuff and prefer to stay to a much more kind of nuts and bolts approach of, here's what you're good at, and here's what you say you're interested in, and here's something that's a good fit. Why don't you go do that? That's exaggerating a bit, but this more actuarial approach, the likelihood of your success will be greater if you do this. And I think was it Jack Williamson out in Minnesota? It's definitely out in Minnesota. It was going to be the epicenter of this stuff. Okay. Last, we're getting close here. Phase 4, starting somewhere, I don't know, late 70s, early to mid 80s, somewhere in there. As far as I can tell, more or less true to the present day. So it's much harder to have a clear vision of what's happening now than it is of what happened in the distant past. Things, get more focused with hindsight. The real paradox we're all dealing with is that we actually need career counseling more than ever, because we're back in that world like the 1890s, if not more so, where so much is changing, it's so confusing. And even in the course of our own lives, we're likely not only to change jobs, but perhaps to change occupations, more once, twice, or more. And yet there's less and less availability here. So we're in a time, again, of great upheaval in many ways, and a time when careers are increasingly complex. We really could use some good career counseling. And what I'll say, just to, again, try to amp you up a little bit here is, in some ways, The career counselors were way ahead of their time. You know, psychotherapy, started by the 1980s to shift a bit away from assuming that everybody would benefit maximally from kind of open-ended long-term therapy. So yes, we'll start meeting until we agree that you're feeling enough better to stop. And then it goes on for 2 years, 3 years, meeting once or twice a week. The therapy starts moving more towards shorter term models. Can we do it in 15 or 20 sessions? And even brief, what's known as solution-focused therapy, where you may only plan to meet somebody 3, 4, 5 times. You're going to do as much work as you can in that time frame to help them with their problem, and then send them out. And if they're going to need you again at some point in the future for 1, 2, 3 sessions, they can come back. That's what career counselors always did. They never met with people for 2 years straight. It's always been this brief model. So in some ways, they have a lot to teach the rest of us, even those of us who are not primarily interested in career counseling, about how to do focused work and get something done for the benefit of your client without sucking them in to a long-term process. You also have in this time frame seen increasing cross-pollination, integration of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy approaches, and maybe increasingly nowadays narrative approaches into career counseling. So there's a good deal of cross-pollination going on. What comes next? Don't know for sure. Who does, right? Forecasting the future is difficult. The best we can do in career counseling is to say, yeah, that's a good idea you have. There's a pretty good chance that that'll work out for you. And I hope that this will work out for all of you. If there's one lesson I want you to leave with, though, it's this. I don't care what your orientation is. If you're doing career counseling, treat it like counseling. It's real counseling. It's not just some, tell them to do something kind of a deal. So whatever your skill set, use it. Whatever your knowledge base, use it. Career counseling is counseling. And that is probably a good place for us to end.